I first heard that Beck and Woods, the writers of A Quiet Place, were going to direct an A24 horror movie, I was so excited that I didn't watch any trailers, avoided any photos or extra plot details, especially after their last movie was so disappointing and rushed that I'm not convinced it was even finished. I wanted to see A24 give them more creative control, and unfortunately, like many religious leaders, they may have had a little too much control on this one. Heretic follows two Mormon missionaries played by Sophie Thatcher and Chloe East, who one fateful night have an appointment with Mr. Reed, get it? Played by Hugh Grant, who traps them in his house and begins playing deadly mind games that question their faith and grip on reality. So for the first 10 to 20 minutes, the dialogue between the sisters themselves, or when they're talking with Mr. Reed, where halfway through conversations they start blurting out random segues into different topics, or they begin repeating certain lines over and over again, it felt so unrealistic and awkward, even by normal Mormon standards of speaking that's half casual, half censored, to the point where I wasn't sure what kind of tone or vibe Beck and Woods were going for. But as soon as Mr. Reed begins challenging their beliefs in a way that they've never been prepared for or never contemplated themselves, almost like an interrogation, that's where the psychological horror of this really shines. You feel the claustrophobia of this house through Chung Chun-hoon's cinematography that uses so many creative, creepy angles to intensify every conversation at just the right moment. Or when Mr. Reed's out of sight and you can only see his shadow through a door hinge or a window, the use of sound design plants different ideas as to what could be going on behind closed doors and just raises the dread of what might happen next. But surprisingly, the philosophical dialogue and battle of wits between our leads was what made me tense up the most, and like everyone's pointed out, a lot of that comes from Hugh Grant giving a career best performance. I was beyond impressed at how he was able to chew up the scenery without ever going too over the top, because he does the usual shtick of threatening his victims in the most polite way possible with these subtle yet devilish evil grins, but he never screams, curses at them, or lashes out, which actually makes him scarier because he's so confident in his quiet intellect and skills of persuasion that he feels he doesn't need to use threats or violence. Up to a point, we'll get to that part later. But what I loved about his character most was that when the girls start confronting him about lies he made in earlier conversations, he actually turns that against them by saying, I said something, you believed it without even questioning it. He is so prepared to turn any conversation into analogy on his beliefs in religion, to the point where the best scene in this is him using board games and songs as analogies for how certain scriptures are based off one another. I won't spoil how, but it was just ingenious. But at the same time, even if you're an atheist like me and believe in many of the points that he's making, you still root for these girls because, for starters, there are actually genuine holes that they poke into his arguments that he can't answer, and that's where Sophie Thatcher and Chloe East's performances shine the most. They spend so much screen time in fear that they can't answer his questions, let alone escape his wrath. So when they're finally brave enough to stand up for him, you feel the weight of it. It is palpable. Hell, at one point one of the girls even says, maybe this guy's lying about being an atheist. This could be an act of God trying to test our faith, and there comes a point in time where that actually could be the case. But even when they're having a crisis of faith or can't refute his questions, it's clear that they're spreading gospel out of genuine care for other people, whereas Reed is so cynical towards the belief in any deity that he's more interested in forcibly controlling and converting people to his side the way that, well, many religious people do. I like that this script is fair enough to point out that religion and atheism ideologically can both be weaponized to harm others. Now, this is all the first half of the movie, and if the entire film was just these three characters playing psychological warfare in this house, I would have loved it, but about halfway through, after a great confrontation where these girls have to decide which door to enter in order to escape, it turns into a more generic horror movie that separates the missionaries from Hugh Grant for significant amounts of time, and to be honest, when the missionaries are just on their own talking with each other, they're just not that interesting. One girl has a dead parent, which of course questions her faith, and the other girl was just born into it, and that's really all we know about them. And it breaks the claustrophobic vibe of this house being the main setting by introducing more characters, one of them being Foreman as their elder in order to explain how nobody can notice that these girls have gone missing, and I'm fine with one character checking up on them in one scene, but they give him like 4 or 5 of him basically doing nothing other than looking like Jiminy Glick. Like, you really let yourself go there, dumbass. And without spoiling anything, Hugh Grant's not the only one in this house. This isn't the first time he's done something like this towards a religious figure, and in the process, his evil plan becomes much more convoluted to the point where they have to throw in flashbacks and exposition at the same time in order to explain how any of what he's done throughout the entire movie was supposed to make sense, but by dumbing everything down, it ironically makes his plot even more implausible because, for starters, there are times where our main leads should have noticed certain clues at given moments, no matter how traumatized they were, because they walk past certain areas looking for a door, a window, or an escape, and I'm just sitting there going, well, how the fuck do you not notice any of this? And it also means that Mr. Reed would have to be more physical towards his victims, and let's be honest, these girls could have taken him at any moment, let alone the others who show up in this house. I'm sorry, but like, psychological warfare is not enough for him to succeed with this plan. But worst of all, there are so many scenes in the climax that wax poetic about what the characters truly think about religion in the end, where, if I'm being honest, it would have been scarier if they had left it ambiguous. And there are so many times where you think it's gonna end, but then it goes on for another 20 minutes and just waxes poetic about the same shit in different words. There are way too many fucking false endings that it's just ridiculous. I don't regret seeing Heretic because there was so much about it that I did like. When it is psychological warfare between the religious and the secular, it's super impactful, and Hugh Grant should really be a horror villain more often because he's really good at it with giving so much nuance and subtlety towards it, but it damns itself halfway through by settling for cheaper frills and even more plot conveniences that I just couldn't buy into. But I do encourage that you give this at least one watch based on how many people truly love it for basically the same reasons I enjoyed it up to a point. Like, it really depends on the viewer, it depends on how invested you are in religious debate and conversation, which sometimes I am, sometimes I'm not, but when it gets it right, it's warranted enough to see it in theaters. So, with that, guys, thanks as always for watching. Let me know in the comments below what you thought of Heretic. Be sure to stay tuned for more reviews, check me out on Patreon, and buy me a coffee. And be sure to like and subscribe. Take care.